The sound of a shovel striking hard earth broke the morning stillness, each thrust into the soil punctuated by quiet sobs as Victoria Anderson knelt beside her beloved garden, the flowers wilting just as her heart had in the months since her husband's passing. The spring of 1876 had arrived in the small town of Cottonwood Creek, Colorado Territory. But for Victoria, the world remained trapped in the bitter winter of grief. Victoria wiped her tear-stained cheeks with the back of her soil-covered hand, leaving a streak of dirt across her face. At 25, she had never imagined herself a widow. 3 years of marriage to Thomas Anderson had been cut brutally short by a robbery gone wrong at the general store he'd owned. Now, 6 months later, she still found herself talking to him as she tended the garden they had planted together, her words carried away by the wind. "The sweet peas are coming in nicely, Thomas," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You always said they'd be beautiful this year." The small house at the edge of town felt impossibly large and empty without him. The garden had become both her sanctuary and the place where her grief felt most raw. It was where Thomas had proposed, where they had planned their future, where he dreamed aloud about the children they would raise. Now it held only memories and the flowers they'd planted together, which she struggled to keep alive without his guiding hand. Across town, Caleb Kincaid guided his horse through Cottonwood Creek's main street, his eyes taking in the changes since he'd last passed through 3 years prior. At 30, he'd spent more than a decade driving cattle across the West, working ranches from Texas to Montana, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots. Something about this town, though, had always called to him during his infrequent visits. Caleb dismounted outside the livery stable, his boots raising small clouds of dust as they hit the ground. His tall frame, weathered by years under the open sky, drew glances from passers-by. He nodded politely but kept to himself as he arranged boarding for his horse. "Staying long this time, Mr. Kincaid?" asked the stable owner, Martin Doyle, taking the reins of Caleb's chestnut gelding. "Not sure yet," Caleb replied, his voice deep and quiet. "Got a letter about some ranch land for sale outside town. Thought I might take a look." Martin nodded. "Barnett Place. Good land, good water. Been sitting empty since old Jeff passed last winter." He hesitated. "We've had our share of loss round here lately." Caleb raised an eyebrow, waiting for the man to continue. "Thomas Anderson ran the general store. Shot dead by some drifters 6 months back, left his young wife all alone." Martin shook his head. "Victoria's a good woman, keeps to herself now though, just tends that garden of theirs and hardly comes to town." Something in the story caught Caleb's attention. "That's a hard road for anyone, especially out here." After securing a room at the modest hotel, Caleb spent the afternoon looking into the Barnett property. Years of saving his earnings had finally put him in a position to consider settling down, and something about Cottonwood Creek felt right. The land was promising good grazing, a reliable creek, and a small but solid cabin that could be expanded. As he rode back toward town near sunset, Caleb took a different route, one that led him past scattered homesteads on the outskirts. He slowed his horse as he approached a small house with a garden that seemed to burst with color despite the early season. Kneeling among the flowers was a woman with auburn hair pulled back in a loose braid, her shoulders shaking slightly. Victoria hadn't meant to cry today. She'd promised herself a reprieve from tears, but as she pruned the roses Thomas had given her for their first anniversary, the memories had overwhelmed her once again. She was so absorbed in her grief that she didn't notice the horseman approaching until his shadow fell across the garden. "Pardon me, madam," Caleb said softly, not wanting to startle her. "Didn't mean to intrude." Victoria quickly wiped her eyes and stood, embarrassed to be caught in such a vulnerable moment. "It's all right," she replied, trying to compose herself. "Can I help you with something?" Caleb removed his hat, revealing dark hair with touches of gray at the temples. "Just passing by and admired your garden. It's mighty fine work." Despite herself, Victoria felt a small spark of pride. "Thank you, my husband and I," she stopped, swallowing hard. My late husband and I planted it together. Understanding dawned in Caleb's eyes. You must be Mrs. Anderson, Victoria nodded, wondering how this stranger knew her name. Caleb Kincaid, madam, he introduced himself. I heard about your loss in town, I'm sorry. There was something in his tone, not pity, but genuine empathy that kept Victoria from dismissing him as she had so many well-meaning townspeople. Thank you, Mr. Kincaid. An awkward silence fell between them, broken only by the distant call of a meadowlark. Caleb shifted his weight, suddenly feeling like an intruder on her private grief. Your roses are particularly fine, he offered, gesturing to the bushes with buds just beginning to show color. Victoria's expression softened slightly. Thomas brought the first bush all the way from Denver on our anniversary, said a beautiful woman deserved beautiful flowers. Her voice caught on the last word. Caleb nodded, unsure what to say but somehow reluctant to leave. Sounds like he was a good man. The best, Victoria whispered, then straightened her shoulders. Are you new to Cottonwood Creek, Mr. Kincaid? Just passing through, Caleb replied, then amended. Well, maybe not just passing. Looking at the old Barnett place, thinking of settling down after years on the trail. You're a cowboy, Victoria observed, noting his worn clothes and the way he carried himself. Caleb smiled slightly. Guilty as charged, drove cattle most of my life, saved enough to maybe start my own small spread. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden, Victoria surprised herself by asking, Would you care for some coffee, Mr. Kincaid? It's the least I can offer for your kind words about my garden. The invitation seemed to surprise them both. Victoria hadn't invited anyone to her home since the funeral, and Caleb hadn't expected more than a brief exchange. Yet something about the lonely widow and her beautiful garden pulled at him. I'd be honored, Mrs. Anderson, if you're sure it's no trouble. Victoria led him to the small porch where two rocking chairs sat side by side. Please, make yourself comfortable, I'll just be a moment. Inside the kitchen, Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she prepared the coffee. What was she thinking, inviting a stranger to her home? Yet there was something calming about Caleb Kincaid's presence, something that had momentarily dulled the sharp edge of her grief. When she returned with two steaming cups, Caleb was standing by the porch rail, gazing at the garden in the fading light. It really is remarkable, he said as she handed him a cup. My mother had a garden when I was a boy in Missouri, nothing this grand, but she loved it something fierce. Victoria settled into one of the rockers. And you, did you inherit her love of growing things? Caleb chuckled softly. Can't say I did. Never stayed in one place long enough to see anything I planted grow. He took a sip of coffee. But I've always appreciated beauty where I find it. They talked as twilight deepened into night, Victoria surprising herself with how easily conversation flowed. Caleb told her of his years driving cattle, of sleeping under stars in Texas and Montana, of the ranch he hoped to build. Victoria spoke of her life before Cottonwood Creek, of growing up in Pennsylvania and traveling west with her parents, of meeting Thomas when her family stopped in town. He convinced my father to stay, she said with a sad smile. Said this town needed a good doctor and that he needed to court me properly. When Caleb finally took his leave, the night was well advanced. Thank you for the coffee and conversation, Mrs. Anderson, he said, replacing his hat. It's the most pleasant evening I've had in some time. Victoria stood at the porch rail. Thank you for stopping, Mr. Kincaid. It's been easier somehow talking to someone new. Caleb hesitated. I'll be looking at that property again tomorrow. Maybe I could stop by afterward. Bring you news of how it looks. The request surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise her. Victoria found herself nodding. I'd like that. Over the next 2 weeks, Caleb's visits became a regular occurrence. Sometimes he brought small gifts, a book from the general store, candy from the confectioner's, and once, a small rose bush he'd found at a nursery in the next town over. To add to your collection, he said simply, presenting the plant with its roots carefully wrapped in damp burlap. Victoria's eyes had filled with tears, but for once they weren't entirely tears of sadness. "That's very thoughtful, Mr. Kincaid." "Caleb," he corrected gently. "I think we've moved past formalities, don't you?" Victoria smiled, the expression transforming her face. "Then you must call me Victoria." Together, they planted the rose in a sunny corner of the garden. As Victoria patted the soil around its base, she felt a strange lightness she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death, not happiness exactly, but a momentary absence of the crushing weight of grief. "It'll bloom red," Caleb told her. "The nursery man said it's a variety from France." Victoria looked up at him, soil smudged across her hands. "Why did you bring me this?" Caleb met her gaze steadily. "Because you deserve beautiful things, Victoria." The words, so similar to what Thomas had once said, should have brought pain. Instead, they sparked something warm in Victoria's chest, a feeling she immediately tried to suppress. She wasn't ready, might never be ready. Caleb seemed to sense her withdrawal. "I've decided to buy the Barnett place," he said, changing the subject. "Signed the papers yesterday." Victoria brushed the dirt from her hands. "Congratulations, it's fine land." "It needs work," Caleb acknowledged. "The cabin's sound but small, fields need clearing." "But it's good water and good soil." He paused. "I'll be staying in town while I get started on repairs." "I'm glad," Victoria said simply, surprising herself with how much she meant it. As spring deepened into summer, Victoria found herself looking forward to Caleb's visits. He would arrive in the late afternoons, sometimes with another plant for her garden, sometimes with nothing but stories of his progress on the ranch. They would work together among the flowers, then sit on her porch as evening fell, talking until the stars emerged. The townspeople noticed. Victoria heard the whispers when she went to buy supplies, saw the glances when she and Caleb walked together after church on Sundays. Some were disapproving. It had been less than a year since Thomas's death, after all. Others seemed hopeful that the young widow might find happiness again. Victoria herself didn't know what to think. The guilt she felt at her growing feelings for Caleb warred with the undeniable comfort his presence brought. She still visited Thomas's grave each Sunday morning, still spoke to him in quiet moments, but the crushing pain had begun to ease. One evening in late July, as they sat on her porch watching fireflies dance in the garden, Caleb spoke of his family. "My father died when I was 14, he said quietly. "Thrown from a horse. My mother never remarried, said she couldn't imagine loving anyone after him." Victoria turned to look at his profile in the fading light. "And you? Have you ever been in love, Caleb?" The question hung between them, weighted with unspoken meaning. "Once," he replied. "Years ago in San Antonio, her father was a banker, thought a cowboy wasn't good enough for his daughter." Caleb shrugged. He was probably right. I had nothing to offer her then. Victoria studied her hands. "And now, what would you offer someone now?" Caleb turned to meet her gaze. "A home, stability, not wealth but enough, and a heart that's waited a long time to find the right place to belong." The air between them seemed to vibrate with possibility. Victoria stood abruptly, moving to the porch rail. "I don't know if I can, Caleb. I don't know if I have the right." He joined her at the rail, careful not to stand too close. "The right to what, Victoria?" "To feel this way about someone who isn't Thomas," she whispered. "To want a future that doesn't include him." Caleb was silent for a long moment. "I never knew your husband," he said finally, "but from everything you've told me, he loved you deeply. Would he want you to spend your life alone?" Tears spilled down Victoria's cheeks. "No," she admitted. "He made me promise at the end that I wouldn't, but it feels like betrayal." "It's not betrayal to keep living, Victoria," Caleb said gently. "It's honoring the love you had by believing it taught you how to love again." He left soon after, giving her space to think. Victoria spent a restless night, torn between the past and the possibility of a future she hadn't imagined possible 6 months earlier. The next morning, she visited Thomas's grave, bringing fresh flowers from their garden. "I don't know what to do," she told the simple headstone. "I care for him, Thomas, not the way I loved you. It's different, but it's real and it's growing, and I'm afraid." A gentle breeze stirred the flowers she'd placed, and Victoria closed her eyes, remembering Thomas's last words to her. "Live beautifully, my love. That's how you'll honor what we had." When Caleb came that evening, Victoria was waiting in the garden. The setting sun cast everything in golden light, including her auburn hair, now loose around her shoulders. "I've been thinking all day," she said without preamble. "About what you said last night." Caleb stood still, his hat in his hands. "And Thomas wanted me to be happy," Victoria said. "He told me so before he died, but it's been hard to imagine happiness without him." She took a deep breath. "Until recently." Hope flickered in Caleb's eyes. "Victoria, I'm not ready for promises," she interrupted. "I don't know when I will be, but I'd like to try to find out." "If you're willing to be patient." The smile that spread across Caleb's face warmed her more than the summer sun. "I've waited 30 years to find someone worth staying in one place for," he said. "I reckon I can wait a while longer." That night, when Caleb left, he kissed her hand in farewell, the first touch between them that wasn't accidental or practical. Victoria felt it like a current running through her body, awakening feelings she had thought buried with Thomas. As summer turned to autumn, their relationship deepened gradually. Caleb made steady progress on his ranch, adding rooms to the cabin, fencing pastures, acquiring a small herd of cattle. Victoria helped him choose furnishings, sewed curtains for the windows, planted flowers around the porch. Together, they created a place that felt increasingly like a home they might someday share. The first real crisis came in October, when 3 of the men suspected in Thomas's murder were captured in Denver and brought to Cottonwood Creek for trial. Victoria was called to testify, to relive the worst day of her life before the entire town. The night before the trial, she fell apart in Caleb's arms on her porch, sobbing so violently he feared she might make herself ill. He held her, murmuring reassurances, wishing he could take the pain away. "I can't do it," she gasped between sobs. "I can't sit in that courtroom and look at them." "You can," Caleb said firmly. "Because you're the strongest person I know, Victoria Anderson, and because Thomas deserves justice." Victoria pulled back to look at him, her face tear-streaked. "Will you be there?" Caleb brushed a strand of hair from her damp cheek. "Right behind you the whole time." The trial lasted 3 days. Victoria's testimony was clear and devastating, her description of the robbery and shooting leaving many in the courtroom in tears. Caleb kept his promise, sitting directly behind her, a steady presence she could feel even with her back turned. When the verdict came back guilty on all counts, Victoria felt a complex mix of emotions: relief, vindication, and a strange sense of emptiness. Justice wouldn't bring Thomas back. Outside the courthouse, as the convicted men were led away to await sentencing, Caleb found Victoria standing alone, watching the autumn leaves scatter across the street. "It's over," she said quietly as he approached. "Yes," Caleb agreed, standing beside her. "How do you feel?" Victoria considered the question. "Like I can finally look forward instead of back." That night, in her garden under a sky filled with stars, Victoria kissed Caleb for the first time. It was gentle and tentative, a question more than a declaration, but it held the promise of more. "I'm falling in love with you," she whispered against his lips. "I thought I should tell you that." Caleb cradled her face in his hands. "I've been in love with you since the first day I saw you crying in this garden," he admitted, "but I needed to give you time to be sure." As winter approached, Victoria found herself spending more time at Caleb's ranch. The cabin was cozy now, with a stone fireplace that kept the main room warm even on the coldest days. They would sit before the fire in the evenings, talking of their childhoods, their dreams, the life they might build together. In December, on the anniversary of Thomas's death, Caleb accompanied Victoria to the cemetery. He stood back respectfully as she placed a wreath on the grave, speaking quietly to her first love. When she finally turned away, her eyes were dry. "I'll always miss him," she told Caleb as they walked hand in hand back to town. "He was my first love, and part of my heart will always be his." "As it should be," Caleb replied, squeezing her hand. Love doesn't divide, Victoria, it multiplies. Christmas came, bringing with it a heavy snowfall that blanketed Cottonwood Creek in white. Victoria invited Caleb to dinner, cooking Thomas's favorite holiday meal but setting the table with new candles, creating a blend of past and present that felt right. After dinner, as they sat before her fireplace, Caleb took her hand. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. Victoria expected a Christmas gift, perhaps jewelry or a book. Instead, he placed a small envelope in her palm. Curious, she opened it to find a deed. "I don't understand," she said, looking at the document. "It's for this house," Caleb explained. "I bought it from you." Victoria's confusion deepened. "But it's my house. I already own it," Caleb smiled. "Yes, but now I'm giving it back to you free and clear as your own property, not as Thomas's widow." Understanding dawned. In Colorado territory, as in much of the West, a woman's property rights were limited. As Thomas's widow, Victoria could stay in their home, but legally it remained part of his estate, subject to claims from his relatives or creditors. "You bought my house so I could own it outright," she said wonderingly. Caleb nodded. "So you can choose what to do with it, keep it, sell it, whatever you decide without anyone else having a say." He took both her hands in his. "I want you to be with me because you choose to be, Victoria, not because you have no other options." Tears filled her eyes, tears of gratitude and love rather than grief. "No one has ever given me such freedom before." "There's one more thing," Caleb said, reaching into his pocket again. This time he withdrew a small velvet box. "I'm not asking for an answer tonight. I want you to think about it, be absolutely certain." Victoria's heart raced as he opened the box to reveal a simple but beautiful diamond ring. "Victoria Anderson, I love you more than I ever thought possible," Caleb said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "When you're ready, whether that's tomorrow or next year, I want to make a life with you, build something lasting, grow old watching you tend our garden." Victoria looked from the ring to Caleb's face, seeing all her possible futures in his eyes. "Ask me," she whispered. "Please, just ask me." Caleb took a deep breath. "Will you marry me, Victoria?" Her answer was immediate and certain. Yes. They were married in April 1877, just as Victoria's garden burst into its spring glory. The entire town turned out for the ceremony, held under an arbor Caleb had built and Victoria had covered with climbing roses. Victoria wore a new dress of pale blue rather than traditional white, a nod to the fact that this was a second beginning rather than a first. In her hands, she carried a bouquet that included flowers from every plant Thomas had given her, intermingled with blooms from those Caleb had added to the garden. Pastor Miller spoke of love's enduring nature, of its ability to heal and transform, of second chances and new beginnings. Victoria and Caleb exchanged simple vows they had written together, promises to honor both their shared past and their common future. When they kissed as husband and wife, Victoria felt a perfect sense of rightness settle in her heart. Thomas would always be a part of her, but Caleb was her future, and it stretched before them bright with possibility. After the celebration, they returned to the ranch, their home now. Victoria had decided to keep her house in town as well, renting it to the new schoolteacher and her husband, ensuring the garden would continue to be tended. As twilight fell on their wedding day, Caleb led Victoria to the garden he had secretly planted behind their cabin, roses and sweet peas, lilacs and lavender, all the flowers she loved most. "I wanted you to have a garden here too," he explained. "A place that's ours from the beginning." Victoria walked among the newly planted flowers, touching their leaves and buds with gentle fingers. "It's perfect," she said, her voice full of emotion. "Thank you for understanding how much this means to me." Caleb pulled her into his arms. "I understand because I love all of you, Victoria, your past as well as our future." In the years that followed, both garden and ranch flourished. Victoria and Caleb welcomed 2 children, a daughter, Margaret, named for Victoria's mother, and a son they called Thomas, honoring the man whose love had taught Victoria how to open her heart again. On summer evenings, when the children were asleep and the day's work was done, Victoria and Caleb would sit on their porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and purple. Sometimes they spoke of their plans for the ranch, of the children's futures, of the community they were helping to build. Other times they sat in companionable silence, content in each other's presence. On one such evening, as their 10th anniversary approached, Victoria turned to her husband with a smile. "Do you remember the first day we met, when you found me crying in my garden?" Caleb nodded, taking her hand. "I remember thinking you were the saddest, most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. And hoping somehow I might make you smile." Victoria leaned her head on his shoulder. "I never imagined then that I could be this happy again, that grief could give way to so much joy." "That's what I love most about you," Caleb said, kissing the top of her head. "Your capacity for joy despite having known such sorrow." As darkness fell and stars appeared above their ranch, Victoria thought of how far she had come from that grief-stricken widow crying in her garden. Life had taught her its most difficult lesson, that love, once found, could be lost in an instant. But it had also shown her its most beautiful truth, that love, even after loss, could bloom again, as constant and renewing as the flowers in her garden. And in Caleb's arms, Victoria had found not just a second chance at love, but a forever to believe in.